Welcome and thank you for joining me today to talk about a difficult subject that most people have a hard time talking about. How do we build strength in the face of loss and grief? I am Dr. Luz Garcini, and I am an assistant professor at the Center for Research to Advance Community Health at UT Health San Antonio. And beyond that, you might ask yourself, what do I know about the process of bereavement? So for that, I have had a fair amount of loss in my life. I lost my father when I was very young, and after that, I lost other important family figures in my life. And I've also worked with a lot of families who have lost loved ones. So I feel like I have seen the good and the bad of the entire process, as well as have engaged in some research as to what do we know about what helps people to cope with loss. That's not to say that we have a long way to go. So hopefully in the sessions today, we'll be able to give you some very simple tips as to how you can build strength during this difficult transition that you're facing. One of the most important things to emphasize is that first of all, you need to think about your discomfort level as you're attending this session. If at any point you feel uncomfortable with something that we talk about, or that you feel like you need to take a break, please feel free to leave the webinar and come back and listen to it at a later time. Let me walk you through what some of the things that we'll be talking about. So first, I will provide some background about grief and what is the grief process. And then we will go into three sections. The first one is aiming to identify how to put into words what you're going through so that you can learn how to best meet your own needs, but most importantly, how can you communicate to your loved ones and others around you what is it that you need. The second part, we will talk about how to build basic skills to cope with these difficult moments. And then finally, we will end with talking about how do you learn to adjust to a world without your loved one. Does not mean that you let go of your loved one or that you forget them, but it means that you learn to honor their presence in your life so that you move forward and find better ways to continue to be connected with themselves. And then we'll talk about some helpful resources that we will be able to email you if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that. Along with this webinar is this booklet that we have put together for you with very simple exercises that you can use on your own. Maybe at the end of the day, we talk about trying to find spaces that can help you process your grief and your loss, where you can sit down at the end of the day and find some moments of reflections. Sometimes that is the place where we hear that voice that sometimes tells us good things, but sometimes challenges and puts us in a spot that is not very comfortable to listen to. So I invite you to reflect and find a space within your home, within your garden, wherever that is, that you can sit down and listen to that voice, listen to those thoughts. And that is an opportunity to use this booklet with the exercises that we will be presenting to you. So what is grief? So the first thing is that we need to emphasize is that grief is a natural response to a very painful process. The good news is that it does not always require treatment, yet that does not mean it's less painful. Grief is very unique in that it is different for everybody. Some people might cry, some people might get angry, some people might start feeling numb, but it doesn't present the same way for everyone. And this is why it is so important that you learn to put into words what your own grieving process is, so that you can communicate to your loved ones what your needs are. Ironically, as painful and as unique as it is a universal experience that will touch all of us at some point in our lives. All of us, no matter what, will go through the loss of our loved ones. And someday, our loved ones will go through our own loss, even though we try to not think about that process. So what can you learn in your own process of grief that you can pass on to your loved ones so that the day that it is our turn, we can show them how to cope with their own losses? Another question that often people ask themselves is, why do we grieve? And I want to read a quote from a famous psychologist, Dr. Erich Fromm, that I think summarizes and can give you insight into the why it is such a painful experience. So to spare oneself from grief at all cost can be achieved only at the price of total detachment, which excludes the ability to experience happiness. So I don't know what this might mean something different to everybody, but if I could summarize it in a few words, to me is that we grieve because we love. The pain that you experience throughout your love is a consequence of having had also the opportunity to love. So if we start reframing that loss with that thought in mind, it might start helping you think about how do you move towards the healing process. The stronger the attachment, the more painful the loss. Another common question that we hear about grief from people who are looking for a way to healing is, well, how long does grief last? And an expert on the topic of death and dying, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a physician who did a lot of groundbreaking work in this area, told us that the reality is that you will grieve forever, as scary and as sad as it sounds. You will not get over the loss of your loved one, but you will learn to live with it. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss that you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. Not sure you be the same, not sure you want to be the same. So I know it is hard to think that the grief will never leave you, but it is important for you to think that the grief process will change if you put the time and attention that it needs towards your healing. I know that at times it feels unbearable, yet it is through the process of paying attention to your own feelings, emotions, thoughts, and behavior patterns that you can move it to a process when you can start the healing process. So it is important that you let go of that clock. We cannot tell you, it's not like a recipe when we're cooking that we can tell you A follows B follows C. Grief is so unique and different for everybody. Some people might take longer to feel better, some people might not. But the timing of your grief depends on so many things. It depends on your personality, on who you are and how you cope with things in your life. It depends on what relationship you had with that person that you lost. It depends on the nature of the death itself, where it was unexpected or if it was a long-term illness that is relieving your loved one from suffering. It depends on the support system that you have around you or the resources or the demands of your life. We have heard from, particularly during this pandemic, from many parents that says, I have not had the time to grieve the loss of my husband because I had to appear strong for my children. But then when things begin to settle, that grief comes back after months and sometimes after years. But it's important that as you walk through this process, you let go of that clock, yet always paying attention as to what your own process is. Because grief is not linear or is in stages. Some days are better than others. Some people describe it as a roller coaster of emotions that sometimes gets triggered by memories or events or situations that remind you. So it alternates between acute periods of grief and then periods where you feel a little bit more integrated. Acute periods feel like intense emotions, like everything becomes magnified. You feel disorganized in your thinking, you change emotions quickly, you can feel despair, anxiety, deep sadness. But then you also have a grief that is integrated. A grief, for instance, when you can start remembering the good of that relationship, what is helping you to move forward. That doesn't mean that you're not going to have acute periods of grief in which will you go back and start feeling again that pain, particularly during anniversaries or birthdays or special moments, or when memories, people talk about different triggers that they experience themselves, such as looking at a picture and all of a sudden it feels like you're back to where it all began. But we'll be talking more about this as we move through our series today. And then it's important to pay attention to something that we call complicated grief. So what is complicated grief? Complicated grief is that which presents for a long, long time, but that it doesn't get any better. It impairs your ability to function. It impairs your ability to relate to other people. And it's almost like you feel as if you have lost your desire to continue living. About 10 to 50% of people develop complicated grief. The good news is that it can be treated effectively with psychotherapy. So it is important that you learn to recognize what are some of the symptoms of complicated grief so that you can seek help if you need it. So pertaining to the symptoms, we have intense feelings of sorrow, pain, or rumination over the loss of your loved one that doesn't go away. It's not as if after a certain time, you can unstuck yourself from having these constant recurrent thoughts. It's feelings of isolation from others or social activity that go on for way too long. People stop eating, people stop completely sleeping, they become very weak, and they become physically ill. It's intense and persistent longing for your loved one that doesn't go away. And remember, we mentioned that there will be periods that are of acute grief that are part of the normal process of grieving. Yet the difference is when it happens for a long period of time and it doesn't allow your ability to function. It interferes with your work, with your relationships, with your willingness to continue living, and with your willingness to take care of yourself. So it's important if you have any of these symptoms that you seek help, because there are treatments effective that can help you. So now we're moving into the first portion of this webinar. This is about how do you start putting into words what's happening to you. And again, I'm going to repeat it. Why is this important? Because the first thing is for you to know what your needs are. If you learn to put into words what's happening to you, you're more likely to know what you need to meet those needs. And on the other hand, I wish all of us had a crystal ball that knew what our loved ones will need, but we don't. So it is important that you put into words what's happening to you so that you can communicate to your loved ones or to those people around you, what is it that you need? How can they help you in your grief process? So the first important thing is that grief is as unique as your fingerprint, and it requires patience and self-compassion. These are the biggest gifts that you can give yourself during this difficult transition. You will go to all complex phases in no order. You might experience shock and denial. It will take you to pain. You will go through guilt, shame, anger, frustration, depression, loneliness, anxiety, despair, in no particular order. And hopefully, eventually, you will achieve acceptance. So it is important that throughout this process, you describe what's happening to you, you put it into words, and most importantly, you start having patience towards yourself and self-compassion. And think about it. what are some of the ways in which you can show self-compassion to yourself? How can you practice that? How do you do it towards other people? Is it by giving them a hug? Is it by spending time doing things they like to do? Start turning that and give that to yourself so that you can facilitate your healing process. Then on page 6 of the booklet that I mentioned about, we talk about the importance of putting into writing or starting to notice what are your symptoms of grief. How do you experience your symptoms of grief in your body? What's happening to you? Do you get headaches? Are you having stomach aches? Certain pain in your body that didn't happen before? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Because with that, you will know next time you have one of those symptoms that you need to start paying attention and maybe spending time in those activities that help you feel better. What are those symptoms in your mind? Are you having racing or recurring thoughts, intrusions, nightmares, lack of concentration? Grief can be very disoriented. So we try to suppress all of these thoughts and all of these emotions, but then it ends up bubbling. So it is important that you start writing them and use these exercises to practice putting into words. What emotions are common to you? What are you feeling? How does your grief feels? What behaviors are you having? Are you sleeping more than usual? Less than usual? Are you eating? Are you not eating? Did you completely stop? Did you lose your appetite? Have you lost your spirituality, your sense of faith and strength in a greater power that can help you navigate through this? Have you stopped doing the things that you like doing? So it is important that you start noticing all of these symptoms and put them in writing so that you can be aware. Change begins by becoming aware of what's happening to us. So one that is particularly important to do is to learn to recognize and validate your emotions. It's important that we identify and put into words what are some emotions that we're feeling. A lot of the times, we describe how we feel by saying, I'm not feeling very good, but we can't put into words what that not feeling very good means. We've gotten better with our phones or with our computers are using emojis to depict what we're feeling, but it's hard to put it into words. So if we cannot put it into words, it's very hard for our loved ones to understand what we're going through. So it's important that you observe and experience your emotions, but pay attention without judgment. Because often we can become very cruel judges to ourselves. If you're angry about the loss of your loved one, if you feel shame or guilt, it's important that you acknowledge those experiences without judging yourself. But try to think, put yourself in someone else's shoes. If someone else was in your position, what would you tell them? Would you be understanding towards them? How would you help them? So in doing that, you're giving self-compassion. It's important that we turn that self-compassion toward ourselves and give it to ourselves. So it's important that we normalize the process and say for anyone going through this is probably something that they will feel as well. And emotions are temporary. They will pass and they will change if you can truly embrace the new healing process. Another important component of putting into words what's happening to you and knowing yourself better is to learn to identify a trigger. So what is a trigger? It can be anything. It can be a response to people, to places, to situations that make you feel stress or makes you feel the pain. Some triggers are familiar, while others are the little things on everyday life. Anything can be a trigger. People, places, thoughts, things, activities, situations. So in page 8 of the booklet, we give you an exercise to start thinking, what are those triggers for you? We have heard many things from people who have joined our webinars. Some people have said, my family, Some members of my family are acting as my own trigger right now when they're telling me, you should be over this. You'll start feeling better. And that's not really something that I want to hear at the moment. But only you can identify what are those triggers. Are they pictures? Are there certain flowers? And it's normal to have those triggers. But once you start to learn to recognize them, you will know what to do about them. On your bad days, maybe it's okay to avoid those triggers. But how, on your days when you feel stronger, when you have a little bit more energy, how can you confront those triggers so that you can reframe them and change them into a positive memory that will remind you of a loved one and the good memories about that rather than the sad ones? So start working on these exercises to put into words what it is that you're going through so that you can start on your way towards your healing process. And for this first section, I'm going to leave you with a beautiful quote that unfortunately we don't know the author, but it says, "Grief never ends, but it changes. It's a passage, not a place to stay. The sense of loss must give way if we are to value the life that was lived." So grief is not a sign of weakness. Grieving is the price of caring, and grieving is the result of having had the opportunity to love. Thank you.